These days, F1 engines are expected to do many, many kilometres. They're only actually allowed 3 power units per year. But there was a time when F1 engines would only do 1 qualifying session. Indeed, some parts of the engine would only do 3 laps. We're talking about 1986, the pinnacle and peak of the turbo era, and we're looking at an iteration of a similar engine. Back here at Classic Team Lotus, Chris Dinnage is going to take us through what could well be one of the most powerful Formula One engines ever created, and certainly one of the most intense experiences for the drivers. Take us through this motor, Chris.
This is a 1.5 litre V6 Renault, and the power of it at its pinnacle was never really known, because the Renault dyno only went up to 1,000 horsepower, and it exceeded that. And they believe that in qualifying trim, with the low compression engine and the big turbos, was probably circa 1,200 horsepower.
But nobody actually knows.
No one knew exactly, because
how much it could create, because they didn't have the technology to measure.
It exceeded the dyno capabilities.
So that came along, you're talking about just over a 500 kilo Formula One car.
Yeah, 540 kilos.
Where now they approach 800 in terms of their full weight with the hybrid system, etc. So it's a massive power to weight ratio.
Huge.
Sticky tyres for qualifying. Yep. Take me through which bits of this engine would be non-functional after a qualifying lap, or at least need rebuilding.
The qualifying engines, as I said, were low compression, and the idea with that was because you could put bigger turbos on, therefore you could force more air into them to generate more power. There was no chance that would ever last the distance on the controlled fuel allowance at that time. So the race engine was a different thing altogether. It looked the same. The turbos were smaller, but it had high compressions. The fuel economy was much better, but it was producing 750, 800 horsepower. But from the qualifying perspective, that's when the fun started. In those days, we had 2 sets of qualifying tyres on a Friday and 2 sets of quali tyres on a Saturday. The sessions were an hour long, each one till 2 o'clock both days. And we would go and do the first run early on in the session, and then we come in for the new tyres and the new turbos. So during the qualifying session, we changed turbos.
That's a set of oven gloves if I've ever seen one.
Well, it was a 3-man operation each side. So you had 2 guys who were actually unbolting them, and another guy with a watering can to actually cool down our hands. I mean, it was fun, and it was a challenge for the mechanics, because there would be 3 of us one side and 3 the other, and who could finish the first. You know, it was even that was competitive back in those days.
So twin turbos on either side of the engine, obviously taking the exhaust gas to drive a compressor and literally force the air force air back into the engine. Yeah. And you're talking about 4 bar of boost pressure,
5 bar.
5 bar
in
of boost pressure.
Qualifying trim, and Renault was so confident with their engines by then that the wastegates were taken off and it was capped. So there was no boost control, it was terminal. Whatever the turbo would produce in terms of its speed and its compression of the gases in the compressor went into the engine, and that was 5 bar.
So air is going into the engine at 5 times the pressure that it is in the atmosphere. 1.5 litres of capacity over 6 cylinders, V formation. They were allowed bigger engines in naturally aspirated guys, but they just got nowhere near.
They weren't close. But by this time, the turbo era was in its mix. And the following year, 87, indeed, so much so that they introduced the pop-off valve and controlled the boost to 2.5 bar. But these were special, something else. And when you just closed the wastegate, and you know, the turbo was going to do 3 laps. That was it. The tyres lasted for 1 flying lap. You know, sometimes you might switch from side to side and get an extra run, but predominantly it was a flying lap, and the turbos were the same. So a tyre change and a turbo change mid-session.
Quite incredible machine. Grenades, the Formula One engine that needed turbos as well as tyres.